lives, loss of loved ones, loss of jobs, loss of freedom of movement, and the list goes on. Now the question is, are we adequately dealing with these losses, the feelings that come with it, and the trauma that it causes? Let's talk about loss and trauma now with clinical psychologist Bradley Daniels, who joins us via Skype from here in Johannesburg. Bradley, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Now, some would say, oh, trauma and loss is part of a day-to-day life in South Africa. If you look at our gender-based violence numbers, women are on a daily basis dealing with a trauma of some kind, whether physical trauma or the fear that a trauma just awaits them around every dark nook or cranny. But the pandemic has served up loss, and the lockdown has served up loss on a massive scale. And yet South Africans have just tried to go about their business. Is there a concern that we are not adequately dealing with these feelings of loss and the trauma that comes with it?
Good morning, Marcel, and good morning to the viewers. I think it's quite a big and onerous task to kind of even ask whether we're dealing with the trauma or the loss adequately or not. The reality is that the loss and trauma is really quite deeply entrenched at this point in time. And we almost have to just accept that we all are doing the best that we can with regards to accepting the loss that we're experiencing. So you've mentioned quite a few things in the intro in terms of the loss. So firstly is, our hearts go out to the people who have already lost loved ones. So that is a sense of physical loss, losing loved ones through coronavirus. But then there's also the loss with regards to economically. Some people are losing jobs or are losing different statuses in their particular jobs. And also what we're also seeing is that we all are losing a sense of the life as we used to know it. So with regards to lockdown, and I think just yesterday, as President Cyril Ramaphosa announced moving down to level 2 in the next couple of days, certainly we're seeing a change almost more closely to the life that we used to know, but not quite. In other words, what a lot of academics are saying is that life will never look the same. So the sense of creating the notion of the new normal is almost a way of duping our own brains, because there will never really be a new normal. It will just be a sense of this is now how life is. And I think the quicker we learn to cope with life as it is, the easier it is for us to process and to work with the sense of loss, as you've spoken.
Now, you're talking about adjusting our lives to deal and accept with how our lives will change. But what it brings to mind is the saying that you can't run until you walk, you can't walk until you crawl. Now, to go back with the issue of or the ongoing trauma of dealing with the loss of lives as a result of the coronavirus, would one of the first steps to dealing with that loss be grief, how we mourn? And that too has been impacted by the lockdown, because we cannot gather like we normally do. We cannot console each other like we normally do. What would your advice be to those who are struggling with that specific thing, that not being able to say goodbye, not being able to hug and console? How do you deal with that feeling before you can move forward to the other steps?
Marcel, I think the first thing is that grief, and you bring up the topic of grief, which is an intricate part of any trauma or loss. It's a sense of grieving what used to be. And this is a process which we really cannot rush along. And I think what coronavirus has really brought to us at this particular point in time is that we cannot even go through processes the way we are used to processing. So in a sense, we're almost grieving this new lack or loss of processing. So one of the things that people perhaps need to do is that we really just have to be kind and really have to be gentle with ourselves and with others to be able to just almost get by at this particular point in time. This particular point in time is quite an unusual and quite a peculiar time in our lives, which really is like no other time that you or I or anyone else has particularly seen. So perhaps what you need to start doing is, we talk about this notion of physical distancing, which is still very important. And I think we have to keep with that, particularly as we move into lower levels of lockdown. But perhaps we need to also reinforce our sense of connection through the virtual. So I've already seen people do really amazing tributes, as we've seen just recently with some of our media heroes like Bob Mabena, where people are doing virtual connection. And that's a way of us almost processing the loss of somebody together. Because one of the most important things around making sense of a trauma or a loss is to be able to give it sense, we call it sense making, to be able to make sense of it. And we often do that in conjunction with others. And in this sense of this era of being isolated, physically isolated from one another, it's important that we find other ways of staying connected and being able to make sense of this almost shifting of the times. But I think another thing to also add into people is that there's a sense of impermanence that if we connect to it in a mindful way, it will also help us to be able to move forward in a slightly more constructive and also more functional way, which is the sense that things don't always stay the same. Things are likely to change at any moment. And so if we just connect with the moment as it is now in a mindful manner, we almost are more equipped to be able to deal with reality as it is presented. So it's around staying connected with the reality as opposed to staying connected to the disappointment that things aren't the way that we would want them to be. And I think that's where a lot of people seem to get stuck, is that a lot of emphasis is given around things aren't the way they're supposed to be. We're not supposed to be having funerals which are 50 people or less. We're supposed to be able to mourn our loved ones in the way that we choose. We're supposed to be living our lives in the way that we choose, as opposed to, having to be out of a restaurant by 10 o'clock, not being able to consume alcohol. So it's almost the sense of resistance. And I think in an earlier chat, we may have spoken about the sense of conforming or resisting. That was when we were quite early on in the lockdown, where people could actually decide whether, do we conform to things as they are, or do we spend time resisting, which is very much, if you think about teenagers often have that sense of conforming or resisting the status quo. And I think still this is an ongoing journey for us. And what's important to add on as well is that trauma and loss, like stress, is cumulative. So in other words, whatever trauma you're experiencing now is also impacted and shaded and colored by any experience of loss you've had in the past. So whether it was when you've lost a job the first time, or whether it was when you've lost a loved one the first time, whatever's happening now in terms of loss will also be shaped and colored by that previous loss that you experienced. So loss is cumulative.
Bradley Daniels, thank you so much. Clinical psychologist talking to us live there via Skype from here in Johannesburg. So many important factors brought up by Bradley, and for me the most important being that during this very stressful and anxious time, during a time where we've suffered such massive loss here in South Africa, being gentle with ourselves and allowing ourselves to go through these motions and go through these feelings is so very important. And what we're seeing coming out of speaking to people in Marikana who 8 years on are still dealing with those massive losses and trauma that they had suffered some 8 years ago. Thank you so much for your time this morning.